At precisely 0300 hours, the frigid expanse of the Gulf of Finland ceased to be a simple maritime corridor and became the focal point of a global strategic shift. The vessel, identified as the Fitberg, a primary component in a complex logistical network, glided through the darkness, unaware that it was transitioning from a state of routine navigation to one of total tactical containment. This was not a standard coastal inspection or a symbolic diplomatic gesture. It was the first physical execution of a new doctrine designed to enforce absolute maritime transparency. For more than 3 centuries, the port of St. Petersburg served as a vital strategic window, a critical link between a continental power and the global marketplace. However, within a precise 13-day window, that reality has been fundamentally altered. The encounter on the night of December 30th served as the definitive signal that the era of operational ambiguity in these waters has reached its conclusion. As specialized security units moved to secure the vessel, the shift in the balance of power became undeniable. The strategic patience of the surrounding coastal states has been replaced by a rigorous enforcement of international maritime protocols. What was once a high-volume highway for energy and trade has been transformed into a high-fidelity surveillance zone. Every hull, every sensor, and every navigational anomaly is now scrutinized under the lens of critical infrastructure protection. The door to the Baltic has not merely been closed. It has been secured with a complex net of legal and tactical barriers that redefine the meaning of sovereign boundaries in the 21st century. This is no longer a shared sea. It is a controlled environment where the price of a single miscalculation is total isolation. The strategic geography of Northern Europe has undergone a permanent and irreversible transformation. In what can only be described as a total geopolitical redesign, the accession of Finland and Sweden into the regional security architecture has effectively neutralized long-standing maritime advantages. The Baltic Sea, once a theater of competing interests and contested lanes, has been restructured into a unified operational environment, a tactical basin under the near-total oversight of a singular alliance. This shift is not merely a change in membership, it is a fundamental reconfiguration of the maritime battlespace. From a technical perspective, every square meter of the Baltic coastline is now integrated into a high-fidelity sensor network. The deployment of advanced radar systems, integrated C4 ISR nodes, and underwater acoustic arrays means that the movement of any vessel is tracked from the moment its engines are engaged. The concept of anti-access and area denial, or A2AD, which was once a primary tool of regional projection for certain powers, has been inverted. The geography that previously allowed for the projection of influence now serves as a mechanism for containment. The narrow waters that characterize this region have become a digital and physical filter, where the flow of trade is entirely dependent on compliance with new, rigorous security standards. This redesign is driven by a profound shift in the defensive posture of the smaller coastal states. Nations such as Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania have pioneered a doctrine of high-tech resilience, integrating their intelligence-gathering capabilities with the massive naval and aerial assets of the larger alliance partners. This synergy creates a state of permanent situational awareness that eliminates the possibility of clandestine operations. For any entity attempting to navigate these waters without full transparency, the Baltic has transitioned from a playground of ambiguity into a high-stakes tactical trap. The strategic map has been redrawn, and the new boundaries are enforced by a combination of geographic inevitability and technological superiority. The center of the strategic containment is a geographic anomaly in the Gulf of Finland, a narrow passage that has become the world's most scrutinized maritime bottleneck. In this specific sector, the distance between sovereign maritime jurisdictions shrinks to a corridor of exactly 6 nautical miles. This is not merely a navigational challenge, it is a financial and logistical choke point of existential proportions. Data analysis reveals that approximately 60% of a major continental power's oil and gas exports are forced through this needle's eye. When this passage is restricted or subjected to high-intensity monitoring, the economic consequences are immediate and catastrophic. The physics of this choke point are relentless. Every 24 hours, an estimated 1.5 million barrels of crude oil and petroleum products attempt to transit this corridor. At current market valuations, this represents a liquid capital flow of approximately $100 million per day. To restrict this flow is to effectively bury $3 billion every month in the depths of the Baltic. This revenue is the primary energy source for large-scale industrial and military operations. By utilizing a combination of exclusive economic zone expansions and environmental safety protocols, the coastal states have gained the ability to turn this economic tap off at will. This tactical strangulation operates without the need for traditional naval blockades. Instead, it relies on the absolute control of a 60-kilometer-long door that can be locked using administrative and technical oversight. The ports of St. Petersburg, Primorsk, and Ust-Luga, which serve as the primary outlets for regional energy exports, find their operational utility tied directly to the stability of this 6-mile lane. When this corridor is compromised, the entire economic structure supporting power projection begins to suffocate. The strategic reality is clear. A continental power's ability to finance its global ambitions is now entirely dependent on its ability to navigate a narrow strip of water that is under the constant high-definition surveillance of a unified alliance. The corridor has been transformed from an open highway into a grave for economic aspirations. In the modern theater of operations, the most devastating weapon is not a kinetic projectile, but the strategic application of international regulations. This doctrine, known as lawfare, has been refined into a precision instrument that neutralizes naval power without the expenditure of a single munition. The primary mechanism of this invisible superweapon is the mandatory requirement for protection and indemnity insurance, or P&I coverage. Under international maritime standards, any vessel transiting sensitive waters must possess billion-dollar guarantees to cover potential environmental or navigational disasters. Without valid insurance recognized by Western financial institutions, a ship is technically a floating liability, and coastal states possess the legal authority to intercept, board, and detain it under the guise of public safety. The tactical brilliance of this approach lies in its asymmetry. While a traditional naval blockade is considered an act of war, an environmental safety inspection is a routine administrative procedure. NATO countries have successfully weaponized the technical malfunctions of aging vessels, such as excessive exhaust emissions, rudder instabilities, or the disabling of automatic identification system transponders. When a vessel deactivates its AIS to hide its origin or destination, it is no longer a merchant ship, it is a navigational hazard. This classification allows maritime security forces to exercise right of visit protocols, effectively stripping the vessel of its sovereign immunity. This legal net is designed to be inescapable. A state can mobilize its entire fleet of hypersonic missiles or heavy cruisers, but those assets are useless against the regulatory finding that a tanker is polluting the marine ecosystem. To fire upon a Coast Guard vessel performing a lawful safety inspection would trigger mutual defense protocols, yet to submit to the inspection is to allow the seizure of the cargo and the neutralization of the mission. By shifting the conflict from the kinetic realm to the legal and environmental sphere, the Alliance has created a strategic environment where brute force is rendered obsolete by a set of administrative rules. The battlefield is no longer the high seas, it is the fine print of maritime law. The operational focus of the Baltic containment strategy has transitioned to the systematic identification and neutralization of the Shadow Fleet. This fleet consists of over 600 aging tankers, many exceeding 15 years of service, operating under opaque ownership structures and lacking internationally recognized insurance. These vessels are designed to bypass global economic restrictions by operating as ghosts within the maritime system. However, the technical profile of these ships makes them highly vulnerable to modern interdiction tactics. Because they often operate with deactivated automatic identification system transponders and lack proper maintenance, they are classified by coastal authorities not as commercial assets but as high-risk environmental threats. The incidents involving the vessels Adler and Fitberg represent a fundamental shift in how these ghost ships are handled. In the case of the Adler, the vessel was intercepted within territorial waters after being identified as a floating technical hazard. By exercising the right to inspect uninsured and malfunctioning ships, security forces have effectively pierced the veil of sovereign immunity that these vessels previously relied upon. The Fitberg incident further demonstrated this capability when it was apprehended under suspicion of dual-use activity. Technical analysis of the ship's movement profile revealed inexplicable maneuvers near critical subsea data cables, providing the legal justification for a full boarding and seizure operation. The outcome for the Shadow Fleet is a state of total operational paralysis. Without the ability to secure trillion-dollar guarantees from established Western financial hubs, these ships cannot legally transit through the regulated corridors of the Baltic. NATO intelligence and coastal law enforcement now utilize a high-fidelity tracking grid that makes it impossible for these vessels to hide their true positions. Every dark ship is now treated as a potential crime scene. This systematic hunting process has transformed a massive fleet of 600 tankers into a useless collection of scrap metal, unable to deliver its cargo or generate the revenue required to sustain large-scale logistical operations. The era of clandestine maritime trade in Northern Europe has been effectively terminated by a combination of sensor saturation and rigorous regulatory enforcement. The most severe consequence of the Baltic maritime closure is the total strategic isolation of the Kaliningrad enclave. Positioned deep within the security architecture of Northern Europe, this heavily militarized territory has transitioned from being a primary projection point of advanced kinetic power into a profound logistical liability. Historically, Kaliningrad served as a forward operating base, housing long-range missile systems and sophisticated electronic warfare arrays designed to dominate the regional airspace. However, the geography that once made it a formidable threat now facilitates its complete suffocation. Surrounded entirely by states that have integrated their defensive and regulatory protocols, the enclave has effectively become a hostage fortress. The survival of this territory is dependent on a fragile umbilical cord of supply lines stretching from the port of St. Petersburg. Previously, rail transit through neighboring states provided a secondary logistical route, but rigorous administrative restrictions on sanctioned goods have redirected the vast majority of vital supplies to the sea. With the implementation of the new maritime security doctrine in the Gulf of Finland, this final lifeline has been compromised. The interruption of the flow of fuel, specialized military components, and basic sustenance means that the operational readiness of the forces stationed within the enclave is deteriorating at an accelerated rate. Strategic analysis indicates that without a consistent influx of resources, the sustainability of the region's advanced defensive systems, including the S-400 and Iskander complexes, will reach a critical failure point. This transformation represents a paradigm shift in regional power dynamics. Kaliningrad is no longer a dagger positioned at the heart of Europe. It is a fear island where every military asset requires an increasingly unsustainable amount of logistical support. For military planners, the enclave has shifted from an asset to a vulnerability that must be constantly maintained in a state of high-intensity isolation. The psychological impact on the personnel stationed there is significant, as they are aware that their operational theater is now completely enclosed by an alliance that controls every entry and exit point. The strategic squeeze initiated in the Baltic waters has effectively neutralized the offensive potential of the enclave without a single shot being fired, proving that logistical starvation is a more efficient tool of containment than direct kinetic engagement. The strategic tremors originating from the Baltic reach far beyond the borders of Europe, fundamentally destabilizing the long-term maritime ambitions of major global players. Central to this collapse is the dissolution of the Polar Silk Road Initiative, a massive logistical project predicated on the assumption that northern waters remained a secure and predictable alternative to traditional global shipping lanes. The vision of a trans-Arctic route connecting Asian markets to the European heartland via the Northern Sea Route was built upon the foundation of Russian maritime dominance. However, the systematic locking of the Baltic gates has shattered the viability of this partnership, signaling a profound shift in how global supply chains perceive regional stability. Economic analysis indicates that global logistics giants and international investment hubs now view any route passing through these contested waters as carrying an unacceptable level of unpredictable risk. The seizure of commercial profile vessels and the enforcement of high-intensity regulatory filters have demonstrated that a continental power can no longer guarantee the safety or the sovereign immunity of its trade partners. For strategic planners in Beijing, the inability of a key partner to secure its own backyard, the waters of St. Petersburg and the Gulf of Finland, raises critical questions regarding the security of much larger investments in the Arctic. The partnership, once described as having no limits, now faces the hard limit of geographic and legal containment. This global ripple effect marks the end of Russia's status as a reliable maritime bridge between East and West. As international shipping firms reroute their assets away from the Baltic and the Northern Sea route, the revenue streams required to maintain the specialized infrastructure of the Arctic begin to dry up. The strategic isolation is now absolute, extending from the tactical level in the Baltic to the global level of supply chain management. The message sent to the international community is unequivocal: the Russian route is compromised. By failing to maintain operational control over its primary maritime window, the state has been relegated from a global logistical power to a regional entity struggling to maintain its own domestic survival. The Polar Silk Road has not just been delayed, it has been buried under the weight of a new maritime reality. The 13-day operation in the Baltic Sea serves as the definitive case study for a new era of strategic engagement. The conclusion is undeniable. The traditional metrics of power, once defined by the sheer volume of kinetic assets and the range of missile systems, have been superseded by the mastery of the global economic and legal infrastructure. The regional power in question attempted to project influence through a series of hybrid escalations based on 20th century doctrines, only to find itself ensnared in a 21st century net of total transparency, administrative precision. The Baltic Sea is no longer an exit route or a projection platform for expansionist ambitions. It has been reduced to an 80-kilometer dead-end street where every move is calculated, monitored, and neutralized before it can begin. This strategic squeeze marks the completion of a total geopolitical isolation. Surrounded from the north, south, and west by a unified security architecture, the once expansive maritime vision of a continental power has been effectively contained within its own ports. The failure to adapt to a world where environmental regulations, technical safety standards, and insurance protocols are as lethal as traditional munitions has resulted in a checkmate situation with no viable room for maneuver. The economic lifeline is severed, the shadow fleet is immobilized, and the strategic enclaves are facing long-term logistical exhaustion. This simulation demonstrates that in the modern era, the most effective way to win a conflict is to deny the opponent the ability to participate in the global system. The game, as it was previously understood, has reached its conclusion. The content provided in this video is a strategic simulation generated using advanced artificial intelligence and publicly available geopolitical and military data. This simulation is intended for educational and analytical purposes only. It does not represent 100% accurate real-world information, official government intelligence, or a definitive prediction of future events. Viewers should interpret these findings as a theoretical simulation and a hypothetical scenario based on current strategic trends and maritime doctrines.